Chapter 9. This is tobacco and nicotine. So, as you're probably already aware, nicotine is the active ingredient in tobacco. And this slide is just to show you that there are both wild and cultivated forms of tobacco. That tobacco grows in the wild, but if you have tobacco farmers, they can breed plants that can yield higher nicotine contents. Okay, so that's just to remind you that in the cultivated forms of tobacco, you can have plants that will have higher nicotine yields. Okay, nicotine from tobacco, almost never self-administered in its pure form. Excuse me. And you might already know why. This is because nicotine is going to be pretty poisonous if it's administered in its pure form. So it's very toxic, very dangerous in its purest form. Fortunately, when tobacco is burned, you're getting smaller amounts of nicotine, and that nicotine that is activated when you burn different forms of tobacco is not a pure form of nicotine. But if you were able to, in a laboratory setting, extract a pure form of nicotine, it would be very, very dangerous for someone to consume. Even in the form of tobacco, nicotine is still very dangerous. You still see examples of children that have eaten cigarettes out of a parent's purse, or a pack of cigarettes that's been left laying around the house, and unfortunately in some of those cases that proves lethal. So nicotine in its purest form would be lethal if it were self-administered in its purest form. Okay. What you're going to see here with nicotine is that we're really going to talk about some different forms of nicotine which result in slightly different forms of administration. And so the first that we'll talk about is chewing tobacco. Okay, and so the one thing to understand here is that when we're talking about chewing tobacco, this is not considered oral administration, okay, because there's no, generally, you're not swallowing anything, okay? So in this case, the individual is chewing on the tobacco, and the nicotine is going to be absorbed through the salivary glands in the mouth. Generally, individuals who are chewing tobacco are going to spit the saliva into a cup or some other type of bottle or receptacle. Only rarely, and generally by accident, is a saliva that's associated with chewing tobacco swallowed. Okay? One of the things that, it's going to be important to remember in this chapter is that nicotine is a weak base, okay? It has a pKa of around 8, okay? So that means that even in an environment that's just above neutral, in a very, in a weak basic solution, some ionization, would occur. So even if nicotine were taken orally and, had to be absorbed from the digestive tract, you'd have very little to, very, very little nicotine absorption through the digestive tract, because if you remember, the pH of the stomach is around 1.2, the pH in the intestines, large intestines, around 3.2, and so the nicotine would almost completely ionize. But even if the nicotine did not ionize and it were taken orally, most of it would be subjected to first pass metabolism once the liver secretes enzymes. Okay. These are some other forms. Snuff. This is a form of nicotine where the tobacco leaves have been dried and pulverized, so it's a powder. Our textbook talks about individuals sniffing or snorting it into the nostrils. Personally, my grandmother used to what we call dip snuff, where she placed the powder between her gums and her lower lip. In this case, the saliva of the mouth wettens or moistens that snuff, the nicotine is going to be absorbed through the mucous membranes of the mouth, and then of course the saliva and the powder after they're done is going to be spit out into a receptacle. In the case where snuff is sniffed into the nostrils, then of course the absorption is going to occur through the mucous membranes of the nasal passages. Okay, so here we're going to talk briefly about cigarettes and pipes. In this case, when the tobacco is burned, the nicotine vaporizes, and so the nicotine is going to be contained, quote unquote, in the smoke. Okay, so remember in chapter 1 we talked about whether things are acid or bases, whether they're dissolved in acid or bases, and so in this case the nicotine isn't dissolved per se, but it's vaporized, and when it's in its vaporized form, it's contained within the confines of the smoke molecules. Okay. So here we're going to talk about the major determinant of how much nicotine gets absorbed from a smoked cigarette or pipe. Okay, and so here the volume of smoke that's inhaled is going to determine how much nicotine the smoker gets from that cigarette or pipe. Excuse me. Okay, so the larger the volume of smoke, the more nicotine that the smoker is going to get, the more nicotine that can be absorbed. Okay, so if you took a small puff, okay, then that's going to be less nicotine. Okay, so it's essentially how you're smoking the cigarette in terms of the size of the puff. So the volume of the smoke inhaled, because remember the nicotine is going to be vaporized and contained within the smoke. Okay, so the volume of smoke inhaled is going to determine how much nicotine the smoker gets from a smoked cigarette or pipe. The important thing, or one of the important things to understand here, is that increasing how long you inhale does not have a significant effect on nicotine absorption. So increasing the length of inhalation is not going to increase the amount of nicotine that you get. It's the size of that puff, the size of the inhalation, not the length. Think about it this way. If you were going to swim underwater the length of a pool, what most swimmers do is that they inhale the largest volume of air that their lungs can hold. Okay, consider that your big puff. You're not going to stand at the edge of the pool and do a slow inhalation. You're going to get the largest puff of air that you can in your lungs at once. So I hope that helps you kind of to understand this concept that increasing the length of inhalation isn't going to increase the amount of nicotine that gets absorbed. Okay. And speaking of absorption, when we talk about nicotine, some nicotine can be absorbed in the mouth. Okay, when we're talking about smoked cigarettes and pipes, but how much gets absorbed is going to depend on how the tobacco changes the pH of the saliva. Okay, so we're just going to have this reminder here that nicotine is a weak base. Okay, so the tobacco that's used in cigarettes and cigars is processed differently, and when the tobacco is burned, these produce different or smokes with different pHs. Okay, and so what we're about to talk about is why a cigarette smoker has to inhale the smoke into the lungs in order to receive nicotine, but the cigar smoker does not. Okay, and so here, before I start this discussion of why a cigarette smoker has to inhale the smoke into the lungs but the cigar smoker does not, one of the things that you want to keep in the back of your mind is that nicotine is a weak base. Okay, and you want to keep in mind the principles of ionization that we talk about from chapter 1. Okay, so why does a cigarette smoker have to inhale smoke into the lungs in order to receive nicotine, but the cigar smoker does not? Okay, so cigarettes, the tobacco that is used to produce cigarettes is excuse me, flue cured, or it's cured in more of an enclosed setting. Okay, And then based on the types of chemicals that have been added and it being in those closed settings, you have a different chemical composition in cigarette tobacco than you're going to have in cigar tobacco. But I'll talk about cigar tobacco in a minute. Okay? But when you burn cigarette tobacco, that produces an acidic smoke. So hopefully you're going, aha, I see where she's going. When you burn cigarette tobacco, it produces an acidic smoke. Remember, when you burn the tobacco, the nicotine is going to become vaporized in the smoke. Okay? So, burned cigarette tobacco, it produces an acidic smoke. The acidic smoke lowers the pH of the mouth and the saliva. Because the pH of the mouth and the saliva has been lowered, that causes the nicotine molecule, which is a weak base, to ionize. And so you're going to have little to no absorption of nicotine through the membranes of the mouth. So the smoker has to inhale the nicotine, has to inhale the smoke containing the nicotine into the lungs, okay, where there's going to be less of an effect of the smoke on the pH of the lungs, okay, but they have to inhale that smoke into the lungs in order to get a significant amount of nicotine absorption, okay. So again, you burn cigarette tobacco, that produces an acidic smoke. The acidic smoke lowers the pH of the saliva in the mouth. Because the pH of the saliva in the mouth have been lowered, that means that nicotine, which is a weak base, is going to ionize, which means you're going to get little to no absorption through the membranes of the mouth. So the smoker has to inhale the smoke in the lungs to get any significant amount of nicotine. Okay? Now, with the cigar smoker, cigar tobacco is air cured. So it's not cured in an enclosed setting, okay, or in spaces that are as confined as cigarette tobacco would be. So when you burn cigar tobacco, that produces a basic smoke. The basic smoke does not lower the pH of the mouth or the saliva, okay? Therefore, the nicotine molecule, which itself is a weak base, does not ionize, so the cigar smoker can get nicotine absorption through the membranes of the mouth. Okay? And then in general, if the cigar smoker does inhale, they're probably not going to feel so well because they would be getting too much nicotine, essentially. Okay? So be sure that you understand those concepts. Remember that nicotine is a weak base. Remember what's happening when you burn cigars tobacco. What's happening when you burn cigarette tobacco. Okay, and then those things should fit together neatly. Okay, and let me just insert an interesting factoid here. When we talk about cigarettes and we talk about that acidic smoke and that acidic smoke lowering the pH of the mouth and causing the nicotine molecule to ionize in the mouth, okay? This means that you get nicotine molecules that get trapped in the salivary glands of your mouth, okay? One, this contributes to oral cancers and so forth. Same thing when we talk about chewing tobacco and snuff. Even though you get absorption with those other forms, you still get some nicotine that gets trapped in the salivary glands. But, I digress. But because the cigarette smoker, you get the nicotine that's trapped in the salivary glands of the mouth. This is why insurance companies are able to do buccal swabs or take a swab of your cheek. If they ask you if you're a smoker or not, they're going to do a swab of your cheek. And they'll be able to tell whether or not you've been truthful about whether or not you are a smoker. Okay? And contrary to what people believe, you would have to have not had cigarettes for probably about a week or so, maybe longer than that, for no nicotine to show up in one of those buccal swabs. So that's not a test that you can really trick if you're actually a smoker. Okay? Let's see what we've got next. Okay? Okay. These are some alternate forms of nicotine, and because they are alternate forms of nicotine, they account for some alternate modes of administration. And what you'll notice is that these alternate forms are mostly used in individuals that are trying to quit smoking. Okay, so you've got the nicotine chewing gum. This produces rises and falls in blood nicotine levels because the individual chews a piece of gum, the blood levels rise, and then the blood levels drop, and then they chew another piece of gum until the blood levels rise and drop. So you see there what it goes. Then you have the nicotine patch. Okay. You're probably very familiar with these, seeing lots of commercials for these on the television all the time. But you have the nicotine patches. These are, patches that have a matrix that contains nicotine. It's placed on the skin, and then the nicotine is absorbed through the various dermal layers of the skin into the bloodstream. The blood levels are going to rise over time, remain constant, and then when they start falling is when it's time to generally time to change the patch. Now, when you change the patch will depend on where you are in your step down program, which set of patches you have, and what those instructions are. So different patches will have different doses, etc., etc. And so those patches, or when you change the patch, is going to correspond with where you are in the step down process and so forth. Okay. Then there's actually a nicotine nasal spray as well. So this is akin to things like Afrin and other types of nasal sprays, except that this one contains nicotine. Okay, and so the spray is administered into the nasal passages. The nicotine in that spray is going to be absorbed through the mucous membranes of the nasal passages. And so in this case, the nicotine is going to enter the bloodstream pretty quickly. And so the blood levels are going to most closely mirror changes that you see in a smoker. Okay, and I think we'll have a graph on the next slide that kind of shows us this. Okay, so remember and this is just a single piece of gum here. Okay, so nicotine chewing gum, remember, produces rises and falls in blood nicotine levels. This is our pink line, but that line would be going up and down if we were talking about more than one piece of gum. Okay, let me go back for a second. This white line is our smoked cigarette. So the individual, takes a deep inhalation, deep inhalation of the cigarette smoke, gets that into the lungs, get the absorption. What you're going to see is the blood levels rise fairly quickly. Okay, because remember, there are very large blood vessels that take blood and oxygen from our lungs, take the air from our lungs directly to the brain. And so when you're talking about inhaling, the smoke and the nicotine into the lungs, the nicotine gets absorbed, gets carried right to the brain, and the smoker exhales the smoke. Okay. One of the things that I'm a little picky about that kind of irritates me when I hear people who are nicotine researchers, etc., talking on television shows, they're talking about the smoke, the smoke, the smoke. The smoker is not smoking for the smoke. The smoker is smoking for the nicotine. And so you'll see, I'm careful to say that the nicotine is absorbed through the membranes, into the lungs and get carried straight to the brain. And the smoker exhales the smoke. They're not smoking for the smoke. They're smoking for the nicotine. Okay? But let's get back to our graph. So remember the white line, that's our cigarette. The pink line is our chewing gum. Okay? Now let's look at this. It says it produces rises and falls in levels of nicotine, in blood nicotine levels. Okay? So if you have an individual who's smoking, one cigarette and then another cigarette, then you're going to have rises and falls in nicotine levels. This is the same thing. If you have an individual that's chewing a piece of gum and, it wears off, and then you chew another piece of gum. Now, the important thing here is to understand that this produces rises and falls like a cigarette would, but it does not produce the same levels that a cigarette would. Okay, and so if you look at the graph, you can see that. Okay, then we have the nicotine patch, which is represented by the red line here, and so this is where the patch is put onto the skin. The nicotine is going to be absorbed, and then that's going to remain constant over some period of time until it's time, and then when it starts dropping off, it'd be time to change the patch. Okay, and then the nicotine nasal spray, okay, is going to produce changes in the blood nicotine levels that cigarettes produce. Okay, so the nasal spray is going to actually achieve levels that are similar to the levels that can be achieved with smoking a cigarette. Okay, the gum is going to produce patterns, rises and falls, but the nasal spray is going to produce levels that are more similar to smoking a cigarette. Okay, and I always tell people that if you're in a place like Walmart, Target, Walgreens, CVS, just walk through the aisles and take a look at some of the stuff that's out there. You'll readily see some of these things may or may not be behind the counter now, but look for the nicotine patches. Look for the Nicorette, the nicotine chewing gum. Okay. I have not seen a lot of the nasal spray in a lot of stores, so I'm not sure how popular that is as an option. It may be something that you may have to ask the pharmacist about, and it may not be out on the shelf. But just take a look at what's in there, available in those pharmacy settings in those stores. Okay. So, let's go back for just a second. If we consider this slide, okay, in terms of looking at your blood nicotine levels, looking at, as a function of time, okay, these blood nicotine levels as the absorption of how you administered and time, okay, this is what this slide is getting at. That the route of administration, so whether it was a smoked cigarette, gum, patch, nasal spray, and the time after administration, when you measure it, you're going to determine the patterns of nicotine distribution in the body. So again, how you administer and when you decide to measure it are going to be the things that are going to determine the patterns of nicotine distribution in the body. Okay, so this just reiterates what's going on when we talk about a smoked cigarette. The nicotine is inhaled, high levels of nicotine in the blood, high concentrations in the brain. 30 minutes later, you're going to have nicotine concentrated in the liver, kidneys, salivary gland, and stomach. So in some places where ionization has occurred. And I'm going to stop here so that we can have a break and then we'll pick up.